Okay, so yes, I wanted although we will get to kind of some practical advice about circadian health and sleep. At the end of the talk, I wanted to start with a framing of at least one of the thrusts that my lab has in its research program. And the general idea is that throughout evolution, our biological clock and our circadian system, as we call it, um, has evolved to be extremely sensitive to light. So in fact, most organisms have a functional circadian clock, a functional circadian system. And the main factor that synchronizes the clock that drives circadian rhythmicity is the solar day, the light-dark cycle, because that's a very reliable cue about the 24-hour cycle. So when you learn that our system is exquisitely sensitive to light in terms of its ability to synchronize the central clock that coordinates all our circadian rhythms, one question that emerges is how did our circadian rhythms, and particularly our sleep, which is one of the prominent circadian rhythms that we have, the sleep-wake cycle, evolve when we move from a system like this to a system like this? And I shouldn't use the word evolve because it's been too little time for our system to evolve to respond to a system, to an environment like this. But at least historically, we have very good evidence that sleep and circadian rhythms have changed dramatically when we moved into these post-industrial, highly urbanized environments that we currently live on. So what we do to study this is we focus in two communities that are kind of at the extremes of how urbanized an environment can be. And the first community is a community of indigenous people in northern Argentina, where I'm originally from. And there's an area which is probably one of the most remote places you can get to in Argentina, where the Tobacuan people live. And this has become a really interesting model because what we do is we study sleep under field conditions in these communities. And interestingly, these communities are scattered around a radius of something like 30 to 40 miles. And some of them have 24/7 access to electricity. Some of them have very limited access to electricity. And some of them have no access whatsoever. So it's become kind of a great scenario to study the influence of electricity and specifically of electric light on communities that are otherwise controlled for historical background, genetic background, cultural background, etc., but they differ on their ability to turn the lights on and off. And of course, other things that electricity brings about. And the other community that we study are local Seattleites. We focus a lot on our own undergraduate students taking our classes in biology. As part of that, they do what we call the sleep lab, which is essentially a lab practice where they study their own rhythmicity and then analyze their data and learn about sleep regulation and circadian rhythms. And the way we study sleep in both these communities is by using wrist oximeters that are very similar to a Fitbit or an Apple Watch that tracks your sleep, a little more sophisticated. They can also measure light exposure. And with that, we can extract very accurately and objectively what their sleep timing is. And just to give you a picture of how widely different these two communities are in terms of their lighting environments, the Tobacuan people that live under, let me just grab my, hold on a second. Laser pointer. Okay, so the Tobacuan people that live without access to electricity, they are all day long outdoors. The elements are not a great deal here. It's relatively hot in the summer, cold in the winter, but not extremely cold. Um, and essentially, every day of their life, particularly the ones that have no access to electricity, are exposed to extremely bright levels of light. And um, I invite you, if you have a luminometer in your phone or in your Apple Watch, you may need a more sophisticated luminometer to compare the light intensity outdoors. For instance, now, if we go now outdoors, we'll be exposed to an amount of light that it's measured as 50,000 lux, just to give you an idea of what a noon light intensity would be. And they go from those levels of light intensity, and this is true here even in Seattle, even on a cloudy day, if you step outside, you will be exposed to that kind of lighting. Then in the evening, they go to light levels that are way below the threshold to stimulate our circadian clock. Okay, so that means they are most of the day at very bright light, and in the evening they move on because they have no electric light. They move on to maybe a fire, but very low light intensities. If we compare that to what we do here in Seattle, and I'm using undergrads as an example, but most of you do this, I do that as well, is we spend most of our day indoors. Indoor lighting, just to give you an idea, in the best case scenario, like now I'm sitting in an office with an open window that faces west, actually south, so that's actually, I'm pretty lucky about that. um, I may be exposed to 1,000 lux of light. And in fact, in our classrooms, and I measured this, um, the intensity of light exposure is around 50 lux when you're taking notes. Just to give you an idea that the light intensity that we're exposed on a typical day is about 3 orders of magnitude. That is 1,000 times less than it would be if we spend most of our day outdoors. Okay. But then to aggravate that, what we do in the evening is we stay in the same environments. Maybe we move to another place, but we are essentially still exposed to very bright levels of light intensity, bright to our circadian system. That is, levels that can still stimulate our circadian clock. And this is a strikingly different type of lighting environment. And whether we like it or not, our circadian system evolved for this type of lighting, not for this type of lighting. And that has, very measurable consequences on our circadian rhythms, on our sleep. And I'll show you a picture that in a way summarizes more than a decade of research studying the Tobaquam and studying undergraduate sleep at UW. Um, and this is what we call clock plots. And essentially what it shows is time in the form of clock time. And then what we have here for this Tobaquam community, which has no electricity, is the natural daylight shown in white, and in gray what we have is the natural nighttime or darkness. So this would be sunrise, sunset. And then these thin yellow slices represent noon, solar noon, by the way, and solar midnight, which, as you can see, this is daylight savings for Argentina. And then what we have here is in green, this is the distribution, that is the range at which this sample of people got exposed to an intensity of light that is 50 lux. And we choose 50 lux because we know that that intensity is certainly above the threshold to stimulate our circadian system. Of course, all this light is natural daylight because there's no other sources. And then throughout the day, they will increase, increase, increase. Around this time, they will be exposed to maximum lighting intensity, like 50,000 lux. Then they will decrease, decrease, decrease. And then a couple of hours after sunset, they will be exposed for the last time in the day to 50 lux of light again. And then in purple and light blue, what we have is the time of sleep onset for this community as measured with the wrist actimeters, and the time of sleep offset. So as you can see, they're highly synchronized with the sources of daylight. They go to bed right after daylight ends, and they wake up with the first light of the day. If we compare to that to what undergraduates do with their sleep in a place like Seattle, in this case in the winter, this is why the light portion of the day is smaller. And for this, in this case, just to make things a little more extreme, I plotted weekend data, but the school day data is not that different. And the first thing that I want to call your attention to is the strikingly late exposure to 50 lux of light. So that means that from this time here throughout the day until about 8 hours after sunset, students are exposed to bright levels of light that is brighter enough to stimulate their circadian clock. And in fact, if you think about the term midnight, it doesn't make any sense in our current post-urban style of living or post-industrial style of living, because in fact, what we call midnight is the beginning of our night, right? So solar midnight over here, and in fact, none of them has gone to bed before midnight. And this is the sleep onset for those undergraduates. And very interestingly, they will wake up later, right? Maybe a couple of 2 or 3 hours after sunrise, but not much later than the Tobaquan people, even when they are age matched. And this is really important because if you do the math, it is very clear that this community here of undergraduates is sleeping much less than this community here. By how much? By about 2 hours, which is an amazing amount of sleep to lose on a daily basis, okay? So throughout many, many studies, and I don't have time to go over them, we've shown that in fact electric light has very measurable objective effects on sleep, and in fact not only on sleep but also on our circadian clock. And I'm going to summarize here what the take-home messages of these studies are. First of all, electric light, because, and this is actually not the findings, but actually the reasons why electric light leads to this dramatic delay on sleep, okay? The first reason is that electric light is very arousing. So in other words, electric light is very stimulating. So if you have the lights on in the late evening, you will inhibit sleep, okay? The second reason is that even electric light delays the circadian clock, and if it delays the circadian clock, it will also delay the timing of sleep, because the timing of sleep, as we'll see in a minute, depends directly on your circadian clock. Also, even in electric light, very importantly, delays the onset of melatonin release, both acutely, as it does with sleep that inhibits it, but it also delays it because the melatonin rhythm depends also on the timing of the circadian clock. So there's a dual effect on the effects of melatonin release. And for those of you that haven't heard about melatonin, I'm pretty sure that you heard about it, but you don't probably know what it is. Melatonin is the most important hormonal signal that marks our biological night. So it's an extremely important signal for our brain to know that the nighttime has arrived and when it should end. So if you inhibit melatonin with light, or you delay your clock and in turn delay the melatonin rhythm, you're really screwing up an extremely important night signal that the brain needs to do whatever it needs to do during the night, including sleep. And then indoor electric light reduces our dependence on natural daylight. So the reason that we can spend most of our active day indoors, sitting in a dim lit environment, and when I say dim lit, I mean it in contrast to what it's outside. It may be looking very bright for you now, wherever you are, but it's not. Your visual system is very bad at telling brightness levels. So in other words, if you're reading a piece of paper, you can equally do that outside right now as you can do it indoors with a light intensity that is 1,000 times lower. So your visual system it's not great because it's so adaptable, that it's not great at telling what levels of light intensity you're exposed to. However, your circadian system, or the visual system that controls your circadian rhythms, is highly sensitive to intensities and can certainly tell that difference. So even when it may seem right at your office or your classroom, it is not sufficient for your circadian system, okay? So let's try to understand why particularly light can have so important effects on our circadian clock and in turn on our sleep timing. So this is what we call the dual process of sleep regulation. And this is kind of a basic, very simple model that explains how sleep is timed in a regular basis, on a daily basis, okay? And there are two components to sleep regulation, and that's why it's called the dual process of sleep regulation. And the first component is kind of the one that we can better understand intuitively, and that's what we call the S process, also known as homeostatic regulation of sleep. And essentially what this process says is that let's say that you woke up at 7 a.m., this is time of the day in clock time, there's a sleep measure mechanism or a wakefulness measure mechanism, if you want. It's kind of like a wakefulness thermometer that measures how long you've been awake, and therefore it will build up this S process, which is essentially understood as sleep pressure. The general idea is the longer you're awake throughout the day, the more sleep pressure or sleep necessity you build up. And that will peak around, let's say, close to midnight at 2300, 11 p.m., when, let's say, this person is going to bed, okay? And then as the person falls asleep, that sleep depth or sleep pressure is reduced until the person wakes up at 7 a.m. again, when the pressure has been paid off, if you want, okay? Or the depth of sleep has been paid off by the nocturnal bout of sleep. That's very good. The second process is what we call the circadian process, or C process, that we plotted as wakefulness propensity, just to make things a little bit clearer. You could also plot it as sleep propensity and be out of phase, but this has an advantage, as I will show in a minute. And essentially, the circadian process is your central circadian clock in your brain that tells the rest of the brain and all the sleep centers when it is a good time to be sleeping and when it is a bad time to be sleeping. And essentially, that process will keep you awake during the daytime, and then it will start decaying towards the end of the day, and then it will be minimal in terms of wakefulness around 3 or 4 a.m. in a regular person that goes to bed at 7 and wakes up at 11. So what that means is that around that time, towards the second or the third of the night, you will have very low propensity to be awake according to your circadian clock. Interestingly, when you plot these two together, this becomes visually very simple to interpret. And the general idea is that the whole system is designed so that you fall asleep when the maximum difference occurs between your S sleep propensity and your circadian wakefulness decrease. So when you reach this maximum or magical difference between sleep propensity or sleep pressure and circadian drive to be awake, at some point is big enough that you really fall asleep, okay? In principle, that's when you will fall asleep. Of course, humans are very good at disturbing this beautiful relationship between the sleep homeostat and the circadian clock. And we can delay that sleep onset. We can have a late nap and disrupt this regulation and do different things that will affect this daily regulation. But in principle, the two components will be at a relationship that it will induce sleep onset. Let's say at 11, you will wake up at 7 a.m. when the two curves meet again. So that difference became 0. You wake up and then the cycle starts again. So let's see what happens first with light. Well, light is very interesting because it has, as I said, it can delay sleep acutely, but it also has a very measurable effect on the clock in the C process, on the C process. And that effect depends on the time at which you perceive light. For instance, if you perceive light in the evening, that has a specific effect on the clock, that is that it will delay the clock. So now you move that C curve a little bit to a later time, and it will take a little bit longer to reach that magical difference to fall asleep. So by getting exposed to evening light, you're not just inhibiting sleep acutely, but you're also pushing the sleep time into a later time for the next day and the day after and the day after, okay? Instead, if you perceive light in the morning, that has an advancing effect on the clock. And in fact, if you are a typical human being, most of us have a period of 24 hours and 15 minutes, roughly, because our clock does not have a period that it's exactly 24 hours. So most of us need to advance on a daily basis. So we really need that morning light to be able to advance our clock. So if you get exposed to morning light, you will advance the clock and you will advance that onset of sleep to say 9 or 10 a.m. So that's why if you suffer of delayed sleep and winter depression, your psychiatrist or your sleep doctor will tell you, get a happy light, particularly if you live in Seattle in the winter, and look at it in the early morning. Never look at it in the evening because you're going to make things worse, okay? So very importantly, light has a very differential effect between morning light and evening light on what it does to the biological clock. So one thing that you may wonder after you look at this plot is, well, what's the big deal of being delayed relative to the real solar day, right? Because you could say, well, these undergrads are going to bed at 2 a.m., waking up at, let's say, 11, and they may be having a happy life, particularly on the weekends, they probably do. But is there any consequences of being out of phase with the solar day, right? And one question you may wonder is, maybe artificial light is able to override our natural synchronization with the solar day, and then it shouldn't matter what schedule we follow as long as we are in sync with the artificial light that we want. If that's the case, for instance, there shouldn't be any differences between standard time, daylight savings time, or whatever time you want to live on, right? But as we'll see, that's not necessarily the case. And this is one finding that came out of our laboratory studying several hundred students taking classes in different seasons throughout different years at the University of Washington, that we studied objectively using these wrist altimeters that tell us exactly what they're doing with their sleep behavior, which is much more accurate than asking people, when did you go to bed last night, or when did you wake up yesterday? By the way, I'm not sure whether people can ask questions as I speak. I don't mind it at all if you interrupt with questions, or if you put the questions on the chat and then Anna can either read them to me, or I forgot to say that at the beginning. Maybe it's too late for some of you that had questions before. And otherwise, I can answer questions at the end. Whatever format we follow, I don't care, okay?
Thanks so much. Yeah, we haven't had any specific questions come through so far, but I'll keep an eye on that and let you know.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, so let's take a look at what students do with sleep. And one way in which we measure sleep is by measuring what we call chronotype. What is chronotype? Chronotype is your preference of sleep timing. And it turns out that chronotype is not a capricious choice. It reflects really what your circadian clock wants to do, okay? And in fact, the way we measure chronotype is by measuring what is your sleep timing during weekends, because it turns out that during the weekends, when we have no social obligations, unless you work during the weekends, we default to our circadian timing. We default to our biological time. So the reason why most of us go to bed a little bit later on Friday and Saturday and wake up a little bit later on Saturday and Sunday is not that we just want to do that or that we socialize more. And even that may be also cause, but it's also that our biological clock was actually dictating that timing, and that during the weekdays or work days or school days, you were pressured not to meet that timing, okay? So that's a great marker that we have, because if we look at the weekend sleep timing in any person, we can get a sense of where their biological clock is. And what we take is the timing of the mid sleep. So in other words, if you went to bed, let's say at midnight and woke up at 8, your chronotype is 4. If you went to bed at 11 and woke up at 7, your chronotype is 3, okay? And so on, accounting for how long you sleep. So this is what we see in undergraduates, and just to orient, these are complex plots, but let me walk you through. Each dot here represents the chronotype or the mid sleep on the weekend for one student. And this is broken up by season. So we have yellow for summer, green for spring, light blue for winter, and brown or orange for fall, okay? And then we plot that on the y-axis, that's a chronotype, and then we have two independent axes for the same data, okay? The first thing that I want to call your attention is that there's a huge variability in chronotype among undergrads, okay? So some of them, let's say this student here, has a chronotype of about 9. That means that these students' preference for sleep is going to bed at 5 a.m. and waking up at noon, okay? Just so you picture that. Whereas this student here, who's an extremely early chronotype for particularly this age, goes to bed maybe at 9 and wakes up at 5 a.m., okay? Just to orient yourself where we are. But the big question is, what does chronotype depend on, right? And the first surprise that we got is that when we started this study, my picture was, oh, okay, in Seattle, we have long days in the summer with a lot of light in the evening. So I bet that undergrads are partying until 1 a.m. every summer night. And therefore, they will go to bed later in the summer and wake up later in the summer. And the first thing that we discovered is that, in fact, that was exactly the opposite. In the summer, typically students are going to bed earlier and are waking up earlier, particularly on weekends, which is very surprising. And the first question was why, right? I mean, because this was totally against our prediction. And the first thing that we thought about, what is so different between summer and winter in Seattle, is the amount of daylight hours that you have. We all experience that. And if you haven't noticed, I don't know where you live. So we used as an independent variable how many hours of daylight are student getting, and we can measure this at the individual level. So we know that this dot here got this many hours of light, whereas this student here got this many hours of light, and so on. And I want you to really look at this plot and realize how widely different the exposure to daylight is not only between the winter and the summer, but also within season between one student and the other. Some students get up to 16 hours of daylight in the summer. Some students in the winter are getting barely 5 hours. Okay, that's a huge dramatic difference in light exposure. But what's really interesting is that this explains about 30% of the variability of this data. And just to give you a picture of what this means, is that for every extra hour of daylight that students are getting, they can advance their sleep timing by about half an hour. By the way, this is the total daylight hours during the working days, during the school days, right? Because you can't do the relationship on the same day, because obviously that will lead to a high correlation, because you wake up and turn on the lights, right? And you go to bed after you turn them off. But the bottom line is their behavior in time of light exposure during the school days is determining the timing of their biological clock in a very dramatic way. The second variable that we wanted to correlate this was how much electric light in the evening are they getting exposed to, okay? And the bottom line is the effect is exactly the opposite. The more evening light, the more your clock will be delayed, the more your sleep will be delayed. And this is also depending on season, as you can see by the colors, because in Seattle in winter and fall, we rely more on electric light in the evening, okay? However, very interestingly, the effect size is about half. So in other words, for every extra hour of evening electric light that you get exposed to, you will delay your clock by 15 minutes. And this was a big surprise to us, because if you listen to any circadian biologist, including myself until a couple of years ago, the first thing they will tell you is do not get exposed to bright electric light in the evening. And that's very truth and very important. And you can see how that plays out here. But I think a much more important message is get as much daylight exposure as you can. And if I have one piece of advice for you today, that's it. Even in the winter, if it is overcast, your circadian system will be exposed to about 3 times more, 3 orders of magnitude more, 1,000 times more brighter light if you step outside than if you stayed in your office. And even if you can do that for 10 minutes every hour or every hour and a half, do it. Get outside, look at the sky, and even if it's cloudy and rainy, you will get a shot of light that it's super healthy for your circadian system. Okay? So keep that in mind. Just to put a little bit this more in context, I just wanted to call your attention to the wide difference in chronotype between students that is very prominent between seasons. Students are going to bed much later in the winter than in the summer, but also how bad this would be if we switch Seattle to permanent daylight savings time. Because these students are mainly synchronized by daylight, we'd make this problem even bigger. We'd be asking students to wake up in the middle of the week, the winter school days, essentially in the middle of their biological night, because we'll be imposing an artificial time that has nothing to do with not only the solar day, but also what our biological clock is using to synchronize, which is the solar day. That's the main cue that we're using. So just some take-home messages. This is what we learn across the year, that access to electricity is associated with later sleep onsets, shorter sleep duration. I show you some of that data, but you got the message. Increased variability in sleep timing. This is both in the same person and between persons, and a delay phase of the circadian clock. And this is, we determine that by measuring melatonin and really establishing that, in fact, if you sadly have access to electricity, your clock will be delayed. But very importantly, it doesn't completely isolate us from solar day synchronization, from natural daylight, and therefore a mismatch between your social timing and the solar day is a big problem because it creates a state of misalignment. Okay? And by the way, I mentioned daylight savings time. I'm going to put a plug here for permanent standard time. And I just, beyond the theory and the medical evidence and the circadian basic research evidence that daylight savings time is really bad for us, particularly if we had it in a permanent form in a place like Seattle, it would be devastating. Just get that message very clearly. And these are just some facts about what's going to happen if we switch into permanent daylight savings time. So the second take-home message is, after I finish the talk, contact your senator and say, please do not switch into permanent daylight savings time. I've been doing this for a while and they are not listening, but maybe if all of you write to them, they will. So, first of all, something that many people don't know, daylight savings time, it's an artificial time. At standard time, the sun is at the highest position at noon. In daylight savings time, that happens at 1 a.m. But the problem is our work schedule is still arranged according to the clock, not to solar time, but our internal clock is following solar time, okay? So it's an unnatural time to impose to people. If we switch to daylight savings time, permanent daylight savings time, K through 12 students in Seattle will walk to school at night in the dark for 4 months of the school year. Whereas if we switch into permanent standard time, that will only happen for 2 weeks. You can do the math. I've done it, and it's quite striking when you see that. And in fact, the times that we tried permanent daylight savings time, the main reason why it was stopped was because several kids got killed walking to school in Florida in the middle of the dark. You will be deprived of that morning light that I said was so important. So if you go to in Seattle before 9 a.m. in the winter to your office, it will be dark. You won't see daylight in the morning. Okay. You will get out of your office in the late afternoon. You won't see also daylight in the late afternoon. So you will be deprived of the most important light that there is for circadian health. Okay. Teenagers have a biologically determined late chronotype. Permanent daylight savings time will be particularly devastating for teenagers. It will get their clocks very misaligned with their school timing. And in fact, it will increase their winter depression, not only for everybody, but particularly for teenagers. And then finally, it's going to be extremely hard to get out of bed in the winter under permanent daylight savings time. People relate permanent daylight savings time with summertime because we've only experienced daylight savings time in the summer. So it's happy times, right? Well, we've never experienced daylight savings time in the winter. It's going to feel, and I've been telling people this, and they go, oh, it's going to feel like Monday morning every single working day of your week, okay? Whereas if we are in standard time, it should feel like Friday to get out of bed. Okay, that's my plug for permanent standard time. If you have questions about that, if you need take-home messages to talk to your senators or whoever you're going to convince about this, I can send you this slide and I can answer any questions regarding that. And one thing that is directly related to daylight savings time and in general this misalignment is that this misalignment that we have between weekends and weekdays that I talked about is in general very bad for you. And we call that social jet lag. And this is essentially the misalignment in sleep or in circadian timing between work days and free days. It's more about sleep, not circadian timing. And the reason is what I said. Let's say that during the work days in the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you're waking up, your mid-sleep, sorry, not waking up, is kind of around 3 a.m. or so. So you're waking up, let's say at 7 or whatever time, a reasonable time to get to work. But then on the weekends, you delay, right? Then next week, you're a little bit better with your mid-sleep and your wake-up time, which is here. But then on the weekend, you delay again. So every time we see green triangles, this is your mid-sleep on the weekend. On the weekend, we also oversleep a little bit because we are sleep deprived during the week. The bottom line is that there's a mismatch between your timing in the week, the timing on the weekend, timing on the weekdays, timing on the weekend, timing on the weekdays or work days, timing on the free days, and so on. That can be measured as social jet lag. That is the timing of sleep on the weekend minus the timing of sleep on the weekdays measured as mid-sleep. Why do we care about social jet lag? Well, it's a great predictor of poor physical and mental health. These are just some bullets to just portray how bad social jet lag is. It turns out that the bigger the social jet lag, the shorter your lifespan will be. This is all epidemiological association, right? But there's very good reasons to think that this is a causal relationship. You will have higher cancer prevalence, very much higher metabolic disorders, higher incidence of depression and anxiety too as well. And this is typical of kids with big social jet lag, particularly adolescents, and a low performance overall, both work and work performance. And this is typically true for very low, late chronotypes, what we call owls in our jargon, um, particularly on the first couple of days of the week, Monday and Tuesday, they struggle tremendously to get out of bed. And if they have an early work schedule, we're essentially asking these people to perform in the middle of the biological night, which is the same thing we're doing when we're asking a teenager to get school at 7:30 a.m. It's the same as asking older adults to be at work at around 4 to 5 a.m. Okay. Um, just, I guess, some pieces of recommendations that I can provide. And I actually borrow this 3C concept from Lynn Peoples, who's a scientific journalist that recently published this book, The Inner Clock, which I highly recommend. It's a very practical book that talks about, how light pollution or during the night or lack of brightness during the day affects your biological clock. And it's an outreach level book. And she's a local from here, from Seattle. So one thing is, as I said, in the very first slides that I showed, comparing the Tobaquam to the people living in Seattle, is that we need bright days and dark nights, and that's not what we're doing. So we need to go out during the day, get exposed to daylight, and try to keep dim lights as much as we can in the evening and throughout the night. Okay. This, of course, is very hard. It correlates also with socioeconomic impact. People that live in many times in poor neighborhoods will have a lot of light pollution and will also have more difficult to access daylight because they have maybe less window exposure to daylight, et cetera, et cetera. The second one is consistency, and this relates to the concept of social jet lag. If you can reduce your social jet lag, the worst consistency to keep is the one between weekends and weekdays. But even within the weekdays, we can be very inconsistent or as consistent as we can, not only with our sleep, but also with all our 24-hour habits. And that kind of relates to the last one, which is constraint, which is, for instance, there are some activities that have been found that are optimal at a given time of the day, but also if they are constrained to some times of day. For instance, a typical example is food intake. If you can restrict your food intake to lower number of hours during the day, it will have a lot of metabolic benefits, but it will also feedback on your biological clock and further improve your biological rhythms. So with that, I'd like to thank the people working in my lab. This is now my current lab team. About half of them are working in human models, the other half on animal models, and then our collaborators and sources of funding. And now I can take any questions.